This is Julia Tremp, and I'm relatively new to YouTube, and Diane Muehlbauer and I decided to have a discussion tonight to give a better understanding of what Diane has worked on for over 22 years regarding the Jacob Wetterling case. There's been different scenarios or stories out there, and we believe that the public should hear from Diane herself the truth on what she obtained over a course of many years on the evidence and other corroborating information. So I'm calling Diane now. Diane is here with me on speaker, and we're just going to have a discussion. We talk nearly every day about this case and our frustrations and the things that she's had to deal with law enforcement over the years, the difficulty she's had getting this investigated. The evidence is very solid, and she worked with a private investigator by the name of Larry Peart, and he has staunchly stood behind this evidence until the day he passed away in August of last year, in 2018. So we'll begin with Diane and how she more or less stumbled into this. It wasn't something that she decided to just go out and do. She just started coming across the alleged perpetrators and started learning more and more information and what they had told her over a course of time. And eventually she ended up getting a confession, and it just kept taking off from there, and she kept getting more and more witness statements and so on to further corroborate these confessions. So Diane,
yes, Julie.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like, here we go again, you know, been talking about this for years.
Yeah. All right, my name's Diane Muehlbauer. I'm doing this because I feel people should know. I was a bail agent from like 94-5 on, and worked at the Stearns County Department. At first I didn't find this stuff out working there or anything. I met a father to some friends of ours that came here from Wisconsin and he never went back. He stayed here, and eventually moved in with his boyfriend. And as time went on, there was certain things that drew my attention to, and one was his granddaughter that was saying things about Grandpa scaring her and threatening her about Jacob and stuff like that. Well, later I find out that Lori and Wade turned him in because Lindsay was telling me what Grandpa was doing to her. And all that I know, they did a warrant and did a search on Lou's apartment. Didn't find pictures there, so he was off the book for that one.
Well, did Lindsay say that her grandfather, Lou Coles, molested her or made her look at any or film her?
She was tied to a chair, what I understood, and to watch his movie. Well, the FBI called me, and he said he thinks Lindsay saw a snuff film. So, I don't know. I think it was mainly picture taking. he would bring his boyfriend there, and then Wade and Lori would go out, and they would babysit. And Lindsay said at one point Lou locked him in the basement, and then Lou was alone with her. So eventually he ends up moving in with his boyfriend, and he's out of there. But nothing became of charges on him for doing that, of course.
Well, and didn't Lori make she made this report, and she had difficulty, and they said it would take a very long time when she took it to the prosecutor locally there in the county prosecutor's office. And the report is very disturbing, and you have a copy of that report, and at some point in time we can put links to some of these reports, which are public record.
Yeah, okay. And then through bail bonding, I met a guy. I had bailed out, and when he found out that I met these Bainers, then he told me that he saw them in the ditch that night, come out of the woods into the ditch at 20 to 9.
And then that's Ben Bina, right? The witness that saw...
Ben Bina, yeah, and then he said they messed with him and made life a living hell.
And who messed with him? Is that Stearns County?
He just said they kept messing with him. I would assume.
So they didn't want him to. It sounds like they didn't want him to.
They wanted him to shut up, I think.
Okay.
Be quiet.
And this is about Michael and Richard Boehner that he saw.
Right.
Okay.
See how this started? My partner and I had an office downtown. And Robin knew these guys from the streets. And anyway, Richard Boehner was in prison at the time, and he called her and said that Michael needed to get something off his chest, and he needed somebody he could trust. Well, I didn't know about this till he showed up at my door that night, because Robin and I had paperwork to do. And that night, the first night, he was very, very careful what he said, because, you know, he didn't know me at the time, and you know, but he was giving a story about he was always there in some form at the abduction site. And then, let me think here. So Robin and I met with him a few times, and after that, she didn't want to be involved. She kept telling me the sheriff didn't want me to talk about it and all that stuff. So they were trying to get rid of me, so they went to the administrator and lied, so I couldn't write bonds there. And then I went to work for Larry Peart. Well, Larry came down, talked to Michael the first time, and interviewed him, and Michael got really scared and started crying and said they said if I open my mouth, they'll kill me or my family. So I'm wondering who they are.
And this is the interview that Larry Peart had a transcript on, right?
Right.
Okay.
Well, no. That was just his first meeting.
Oh, okay.
The second one is when he came down with Todd Newman. They were upstairs, and I was wearing a wire. And I was supposed to pick him up at the Tom Thumb, and I go over there. There's two squads facing me. And they didn't come, so I went by their house, and they ran out of the house saying their mother didn't want them to talk. And so that's when they jumped in my car, and we went to my house. Michael came in, he checked all the outlets, made sure there was no devices around. And in the beginning, he was kind of nervous, But then he started talking about it, and that him and Lou and those guys were somewhere, and then they were just told they were going to go drag racing, and we're just going to go out to somebody's house. And they got out there, and of course that's when he said Lou took Jacob. And then they took him to Brenda Boehner's apartment, is what they told me. And
I did hear the tape, and didn't you say that there were some people that said the tape sounded authentic and like he was telling the truth?
Well, I had a lady call me one time, does voice analysis, but then I lost her number, and she said, I just want to tell you, I think this guy's telling the truth. And the thing is, these Boehners, all three of them didn't know I was talking to the other one. And I'm getting the same story, except Richard, when he found Michael was talking, he got really angry. But he did tell some guys in prison about what happened to Jacob, and that they took him, and he says they dismembered him and threw him in the river.
Okay, and you have this all on recording.
Tape.
Right.
Yep, they called me. So every time, let's see, it was turned in July 7th of 97. Larry took it in. He was met with opposition. Olson didn't want to hear anything out of his mouth.
Olson was one of the detectives at Stearns County at the time, right?
Yeah.
At the sheriff's office. Okay.
Right, because it's a county case.
Right.
I had given Patty 3 tapes in 99. I don't know what she did with them because I never heard anything about them. When I gave them to her, all she said was, I'll see if I can find somebody I can trust. I don't know what that meant, but...
Tell me about Denny Sigafus. When Larry and you were dealing with Denny Sigafus, and he was flown in from, I think, New Mexico at the time. He was retired, and he knew something about...
Patty flew him in.
Okay, and this was paid for...
by Pat.
By the foundation, possibly? I'm not sure. But Larry Peart said that the cost for the flight were absorbed. And
yeah.
And so they flew him in for what reason? This was when Larry had slipped and talked about the boys being identified by their private parts. And one of them said that Jacob was chosen because he had the largest testicles. And he had slipped.
Well, no, that didn't have anything to do with Sigafus.
Oh, okay, so that was a
Sigafus
different...
came in here and he confronted Lou at my table because Lou had to take a lie detector test.
Okay.
Okay, and he said, don't worry, Lou, you'll pass. Well, he already knew that Lou took it and he failed it miserably on his granddaughter and Jacob.
Right. He panicked, actually. I saw that lie detector test.
Yeah, and so then we were counting on Denny to, it's like he kind of backed off, and he says, well, you know, a lot of people say that stuff. Well, it wasn't like this, and he knew it, so I think he was threatened with something, and then he couldn't talk to Larry for 2 years. So I think they put a gag order on him or something.
Okay.
But,
so
no,
what
were you just...
So what happened? Okay. Now, didn't Patty say something about she didn't want them going to Stearns County with this because she was concerned about the foundation?
I don't know. That came from Larry.
Okay.
Larry said something about she didn't want Sigafus to tell Stearns County or something.
Okay,
So
and that's in Larry's...
I didn't hear that.
That's in Larry's interview when he was interviewed by a producer a couple years ago. Um, we're trying to get that video in just one comprehensive piece here to give to the public. Um, at any rate, something was mentioned, and Larry was disturbed by that. He didn't like that. He thought that, how could she place that above her son? So, now what happened when Larry slipped? Lou, when Lou Cole slipped about the boys when they were being identified by their private parts, and
that was when Lou was living with his lover. He said, "I'll call you back. I'm going to the Tom Thumb to get cigarettes." To that Tom Thumb, and then he came back. He called me and he said, "Well, I saw that poster of that kid," and I said, "Why would anybody take a little kid?" And he goes, "Well, they took him because he has the biggest testicles." And I said, "What?" And it's like he knew he shouldn't have said that. So, Dennis tried to say Dennis knew it. Okay?
And it's Dennis Shiles.
Right. So after the next day, I don't know who called that meeting, but it was me and Robin and Patty and Lou. And that's where I met Larry Peart for the first time. And Lou was trying to push this on Shiles, but then all of a sudden he pointed his finger in her face and said, "It's not my fault."
And that's in Patty's face, right? Patty Wetterling. Yep. So why would he point his finger in Patty Wetterling's face and say that, I wonder?
I don't know.
And why wouldn't she just say, "Let's take this straight to the FBI"?
Well, let's just take it to the department if they're handling it, right? So the sheriff had to send somebody out to talk to me, so he was sending Dan New to my house, but Dan New really didn't investigate. He was kind of telling me what they were saying and doing down there, and then he said, Doug Pierce said, "Well, she's crazy, she don't know nothing." And they wouldn't take it any further, and they must have either hidden it or something, because I didn't find any of this stuff in the report. And then Lou would go back and forth to Eau Claire sometimes, but he had an old neighbor up there that he was talking to, and she ran a foster care home, and one night he showed up, and he tried to buy that baby she had. And when he said, "I can get you a lot of money for that baby tonight," she thought he meant adoption. He said, "No, they want it for sex." And she said Lou had a lot of money at that time.
Oh, my God.
I mean, Lou's a dishwasher, okay?
And she said right around that time Jacob was taken, or around that time, he came up with, like, over $30,000.
That's what she thought, yeah.
So this is considered hearsay, but this is what she's saying, that Lou had a large sum of money.
Well, she told me that Lou and that DEA that raped Lou were questioned on Wetterling Case up there.
Okay.
But anyway,
But you said her husband saw Lou with money, or?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So.
And she was teasing him because she said, "You're going to take me out and buy me new clothes or what?"
So, so he was really pretty much a witness to this. And now that we're talking about witnesses, I just want to throw this in before I forget. There were two other eyewitnesses that spotted Lou Cole's car in the vicinity of the abduction site. They saw the car speeding, the burgundy vehicle, and you can see this on the NPR report, on the podcast, and these two witnesses, and I know you have their names written down somewhere, saw his vehicle speeding towards the abduction site that night. And the vehicle never came back the other way because, and they notated that, they made note of that it didn't come back the other way. And back then there was a side road, and that side road would go directly to Brenda Boehner's apartment. Also,
I would go down on the highway past Belclair Acres, and then 7 minutes to Brenda's house.
Right, and then, so now you have 3 eyewitnesses that place all 3 at the abduction site. The one that saw the Boehner brothers and the one that saw Lou Cole's vehicle.
Yeah. Yep, and they just would not take this seriously, and they would not investigate it. And
well, there was a lot that you put into this.
Well,
I mean, you put a lot of time, and you worked with Larry, and you tried to get various officials over a long period of time to investigate this. And throughout this whole process, you're accumulating more and more evidence that makes this case a very strong case, very solid for a prosecutor. And you tried to contact, or several times, Janelle Kendall, and Janelle Kendall just wasn't moving. She wasn't doing anything. She wasn't returning your calls. She wasn't making any effort whatsoever to look into this case. And there was a time frame there where Pam Jensen wasn't aware that there was any evidence from right, so she was just kind of put on this case, and
they dumped it in her lap.
Right, and she was not made aware of this evidence. And at that point, that's when she told you that she couldn't find anything related to this 1997 evidence. And then what did you do at that point when she said that she couldn't find anything?
Well, I knew she wasn't in it because when Larry and I went down there one day, she took us in the hall and said that Sheriff Sanders really mad at her for talking to us, which I thought was odd if we're bringing more information in.
I mean, this evidence is rock solid, and they just weren't moving.
Well, I don't think they want it out because I think there's a lot more behind this.
Okay, so back to the part where, Michael Boehner confesses. All right, now there's a part in there, and I know there's been, maybe some misinformation, and we want to make this clear that Michael Boehner alleges that the father put Lou Coles up to it. Okay, we don't know. This has to be investigated, and we don't know if the father was involved, but it doesn't look good for the father based on what the Boehner brothers are saying and some other disturbing information that we will get into in a little bit here. But the behaviors from the Wetterlings aren't good. It's not good, and it doesn't make them look very good. And tell me about when you took this to the father and how he acted.
What do you mean when I took
when
this
you
to
when
the
you
father?
took this evidence to Jacob's father, Jerry Wetterling? How did he act?
I didn't take him anything.
Well, you didn't take him, but you went to tell him or discuss it with him.
Yeah, because Seal wanted me to meet him.
Right.
But he kept talking to her, and I kept saying, you need to hear this. And he just said, oh, Diane, a lot of Diane's probably brought in information. And I said, well, did they bring in a confession? And then he didn't want to talk about it anymore. So that was the end of that. That was the only meeting. And then a guy from Wisconsin, Vern Seitz,
Yes.
comes here, and the foundation told him about me, and he kept calling me, and he said he was Jerry's friend, and Jerry wanted him to meet me in a motel to hear the abduction tape. And I thought that was odd. Why wouldn't the father want to know, right?
Right. So the father is having, from what we're aware of, alleged that he's a pedophile, that he is not a good guy. I mean, based on when Vern was found dead in his home in 2008, the search warrant showed child pornography, posters that he drew of children in bondage and adults abusing them, and all kinds of horrible stuff, books about cannibalism, and it's all in the warrants. And you've got copies of the warrants, and I got a copy of the warrant, and it's very disturbing what they found in this man's home. So this was the kind of man that Jerry had sent over to you to listen to these tapes and to meet you in a hotel. And you said...
I'm sure he'd say he didn't know about him at that time. But then Vern he met me at a cafe in St. Joe and tried to buy the tapes, and he said, I'm prepared to pay you what you want for those tapes. And I said, no, this isn't about money. And then he started sweating, and I thought, well, where would you have money? You're a barber, right?
Right. Well, now, but Vern, he claims to know the Wetterlings. He claimed to have known them for years, right?
Right.
Then the Boehner brothers, they also claim to have known the Wetterlings for years.
Well, Michael Bain told me that they used to go to their house when Jacob was littler, and they drink and play cards. And he said that they knew that his dad was a pedophile and spent time in prison.
So the Wetterlings knew that the Boehner brothers' father, and that was Richard Sr., right?
Right. Yep.
They were all pedophiles in that family. And Michael, when Richard was spending time in jail, it was for raping and sodomizing a 7-year-old boy for 7 years.
Both of them were doing that.
Right, Richard and Michael, but Michael turned state's evidence on his brother, and he got a lighter sentence, which was probation. But Richard actually had to serve time. He was sentenced.
Richard actually should have got, he had priors. He actually should have got 30 years. He got 2.
Yeah.
He did 2 years.
Did 2 years of a 4-year sentence. So he didn't even serve the full sentence that he was given. And it was at that time that he was running his mouth in jail about Jacob and his activity or his involvement in Jacob's abduction. And and one of the things that I find disturbing, which I'll throw in there, is he talks about dismembering the body and throwing the body in the river. This is what their assignment was to do. Okay, they were to, one of their roles in this abduction, allegedly, is to get rid of the body. Okay, well, February 13th or 14th, I think it was the 13th possibly, of 1990, a torso of a boy between the ages of 10 and 13 shows up in the dam by St. Paul. And so this is just a torso, but what are the chances of it being between the ages of 10 and 13 when an 11-year-old boy comes up missing, and the Boehner brothers say they dismembered the body and threw it in the river? Okay, so the river that we're thinking was across state lines in Wisconsin, and we came up with, and we don't know this to be fact because we're just trying to put the puzzle pieces together because it needs to be investigated, but the St. Croix River is right there, and that washes into the Mississippi, and that would be downriver, because it would be south. So it makes sense that, a torso or some of the remains would go. It sounds to me like they threw the torso and then maybe buried the rest of the remains somewhere else. I don't know. Because
bury the identifying parts.
The identifying parts. Now, they did say they found a foot. They find a foot? And then
they said they did. Yeah.
Right. And so in one day, they were able to identify that was not Jacob in one day by a foot that was supposedly nearby after they found his torso. Now, I mean, you're talking like this is, the water's pretty wild around that area, around the dam. So this foot, I don't know.
Just think about this, though. Lou told Marcia, his ex-wife, sent me a tape saying that Lou got mad and because Marcia said Lou kept bringing up Jacob. Okay? And she said, well, we don't know what happened to him. He said he's dead, Marcia Ray. He's 6 blocks from the house in Milltown, Wisconsin.
That's right. That's right. All right. And so that's, I think, how we came up with it. Possibly they put him in the St. Croix River. And, that washes into the Mississippi. But we don't know that to be fact. We just know that all of this information between all of these, the witnesses and the perpetrators, it's all meshing together. It's all the puzzle pieces are fitting together. And it is very powerful and very damning. And you're taking this to Stearns County year after year and trying to get this investigated, and they're mocking you and basically treating you. You got Dougie Pierce, you had Olson was there when Larry took it in there. There's Dan New, and then there was
Dave Noner.
Dave Noner, and
but Dave Noner, at the last meeting I called, he got nervous and he says, I can't rule these guys out because I don't know where they were that night. Well, wouldn't you find out?
Well, and then when we look at the Wetterling file, you fast forward to when they released that Wetterling file, you and Joe were, went to the areas of the files around those years that this was going on when you've got this evidence, and you're not finding anything really that's lining up with the evidence that you have. You just have very vague reports. It looks like they made a very, very low-level effort to, in their interviews of Richard, and it just seems kind of sickening because you knew what you had and you knew how serious it was, and what they were doing with Richard wasn't matching the gravity of what you had on Richard. So they were basically just trying to make it go away, allegedly. I'm not saying that as fact, but that's what it looked like.
Well, I'm sure that's what it is, but what was I going to say here? I started working with Rob Lear from Channel 5. He went to the prison, he interviewed Richard. Richard says right on tape that he went bike riding with Jacob.
So that connects him to the family then.
Right. So then, and Rob Lear actually lost his job after that.
Interesting.
But Richard admits it right on tape on TV, and I have that audio.
Interesting.
I have that video.
Interesting that he lost his job. And then you had Trish Van Pilsen follow you for a number of years. But
10 years.
She couldn't get it out. They wouldn't allow her, we don't know that as fact. We just know that she was there and she was trying to dig up a lot of information. And at one point, didn't she talk to Lou? And Lou, got very agitated.
Well, because she confronted him on his lie detector test. And she said, how'd you do? And he says, you already know, it sounds like. And that's when he kicked her out of the apartment.
Okay, and that was when he was living there in the St. Cloud area?
Yeah.
Okay, so here you got, like, so much, enough to draft warrants, easily draft warrants. You have probable cause, definitely, when you have them on tape confessing to their involvement and saying that he was taken to Brenda Boehner's apartment. Okay, so you have enough probable cause here for her apartment to have a search warrant, for the property, the Boehner properties, to have search warrants, and most definitely search warrants on the Wetterling home when they're telling them that, they believe that the father was involved. Okay, and there's later evidence that you had, or that you have, further evidence of another eyewitness. And we don't want to get into a lot of details on this because when you talk about activity like this, people get themselves all up in a bunch because they don't want to believe these kinds of things happen.
Right.
But they do. It's been proven they do. And you had an expert who teaches law. Criminal justice. Excuse me. And he listened to a tape that you have. And
well, he thought it sounded authentic.
Okay, so he's and
huh?
So this man is saying to another witness that he was there when Jacob got killed. And when he was asked, and I want to make sure I get this right, when he was asked if the father was there, he didn't say directly that the father was there. He just said there were 3 others up there with him. Or there were 3 others there. And at that time, he referenced the father again in the conversation, and he not at any point said the father wasn't there. He just carried on like he knew the father was there. But you never got like a direct, straight answer of, yes, the father was there. He just carried on like, the father was there, by the way the conversation was going. So, I mean, that is very, very strong evidence. It's something that needed to be followed up on. He talks about activity involving, that the Jacob's abduction and murder was elaborately planned. And so this tape, when I heard it, to me, corroborated what you have already. So it was further corroboration on the evidence that you already had in hand. It matched. So how can all of this match and not one serious attempt to investigate this? That's just too weird. I mean, it's beyond that.
Just even recently, they lied to me. I said, if this stuff isn't evidence, you can't keep it. And he said, well, it's evidence. It's open investigation now.
Yeah.
So when you and I talked to him later, I said, you lied to me. And he said, well, the report's out now. Well, none of it that is in the report. The only thing I found was they interviewed Michael, and of course Michael lied and said we were harassing him, questioning him to get out of it.
Of course.
They kept that, but they didn't interview me.
Right, they didn't interview you, and they didn't put any of this other evidence together. They didn't put any of the tips. Okay, no. So we'll get it.
There was a guy that called in on Richard Boehner 6 days after he was taken.
Yes, a witness.
Yeah, I found that interesting, and I found a lot of cult call-ins in '89. People saying check out the cult. There was one guy that he called in and says we got the boy and we're going to sacrifice him tomorrow night. That was another tip. So because I never heard anything about cult stuff all these years until I read those reports.
And this is what this eyewitness is saying, though. He's saying that there was cult activity. And I remember you telling me that at that time you were a little concerned to take that evidence in, but you told him you had the evidence in hand, and that they needed to come investigate it, but they would not. So you took to Stearns County all the basics, the confession tape, some corroborating witness statements, the witness that saw them there, and they needed to take all of that and follow up with you to make sure, to take the rest of the information that you were collecting over a period of time and to use that to further their investigation. And there were no attempts made to do that. There was, at one point you said you spoke with an FBI agent too, and he basically, what was he, just like a babysitter, or just trying to keep you from,
Are you talking about Dan Lund?
Yeah, I mean, didn't you say that
I took him this tape. He's the only one I let listen to it. When I told him what was on it, he put his face away from me. And when it was over, he said, well, what do you think? I said, well, the guy sounds scared that Bernick's questioning him again. He says, or he's telling him what he wants to hear. Well, I knew that was a lie, and I'll tell you why. Because Bernick told my cousin about it 2 years before I even met Bernick. So,
there you go.
Yeah. So I don't think he wanted, so that's why he called me at home that night to tell me he thought Lindsay saw a snuff film. Because I think it bothered Dan.
Well, I think there were probably, now you said that there was an investigator by the name of Dan New, and it sounded to me like he believed all of this information. And
well, he did. He told me to keep taping him.
Okay, there you go. And so he ended up being forced to resign.
He told me they took him in a room and said, here's how it's going to go. You're going to go on a 2-week vacation, and then you're going into early retirement. That was it.
Great. So he loses his job for trying to do his job.
Right.
Okay, so that's another one down the drain. Okay, so you got all this crazy behavior surrounding that seems to transpire as you're just in discovery of all of this corroborating evidence that connects Richard Boehner, Michael Boehner, and Lou Coles to Jacob's abduction, and they all allege the father's involvement, except Lou didn't directly say anything to you, I don't think, but Michael Boehner did, and I don't know if Richard Boehner said the father was involved, but
No.
Okay, so it was just Michael.
Right, and Richard didn't tell me. At one time, though, he was so mad at Michael, he said to me, if I go down for Jacob, I go down for good. And he caught me off guard. I didn't have my tape player on, but that's what he said.
Well, I mean, it goes along with everything else that you have. And I find it very...
And a year ago, I wrote to the head of the FBI, and a copy went to Washington, and I never heard a word. And my one letter to the FBI sat in Minneapolis for 6 days. I don't know what was going on.
Okay, so let's roll into that. Let's roll into when I came into the picture, because people may not understand why this person from Ohio got involved. So I stumbled into it in a very odd way because I didn't know anything about this Wetterling case. I was just watching TV one night, and I don't really watch a lot of TV, and I was just flipping channels, and I saw this show called The Hunt with John Walsh. And they showed this sketch on there, and I later found out from Pam Jensen, who was the investigator assigned to the case at the time, that that sketch really didn't mean anything, but it did end up connecting me to the case because a serial pedophile from Ohio, and at this time I don't know anything about your evidence. So I'm just going on what I know of the case, which is next to nothing. Okay, and so I decide to look into it a little further because this sketch looks like identical to this serial pedophile. It really did. And I even talked with Trish Van Pilsum at the time, and she thought it did too. And at that time, I didn't know about what you had, and I'm imagining around that time they're trying to steer her away from your stuff. So she's just, trying to keep going. And so she's like, God, he really looks like that sketch. I'm going to have to check it out. Well, she couldn't trace this pedophile up there, and this pedophile's name was Harold Jerry Mash. So anybody can Google that name, and they will see what transpired. He was exposed on the front page of the Chicago Tribune because he was working in Chicago public schools, and he had no business being in a school. He was a serial pedophile in Ohio. He got into a lot of trouble here. Somehow he fell through the cracks, and his license was renewed, his teaching license, and he was working for the third largest public school system in the country. Well, we exposed him, we got him pulled out of the school, but he had nothing to do with this case on Jacob. So when I was researching the case, I decided to look further into it because it was pretty intriguing to me. And somehow I stumbled across your name in a like a blogger or one of the sleuthing websites on this case. And at the time, White Pages was listing phone numbers. Unfortunately, you had a home line, you had a landline, and I found you and started talking to you about it. Okay, and then when I started talking to you about it, I said, okay, so, what have been your difficulties, and so you told me all your difficulties with trying to get law enforcement involved. And I said, how about we reach outside of the state? I said, I know that NCMECs can't investigate, but that's who I called first. I just felt like a vibe the minute I saw that Sheriff Sanner. When I saw him on that show, he just looked too starched to me to be like somebody that is going to take this, is going to, I just felt like there was something not right surrounding this case.
He wasn't going to do anything with it, and he left 2 years early.
Right. Well, and this is when I was calling him about MASH. So I thought that, he's not going to do anything with anything. That's how he looked. I just had a bad vibe about him. So when I called about MASH, I called NCMEC first. So I had already experienced talking with this man, Richard Leonard. And Richard Leonard is assigned to the Jacob Wetterling case. So he was in the intake area where he was taking in tips, okay, because they tell you to call NCMEC or Stearns County. I chose NCMEC because I didn't trust Stearns County. So all of my stuff on Harold Jerry Mash was forwarded to NCMEC, and then they forwarded all that information that I collected through that, the last few years to the appropriate parties in law enforcement. So when I talked to you, I said, how about we send this stuff to Richard? And from that point on until now, this was in September of 2014. Well, probably, I watched The Hunt in late August. So I reached out to him before I started talking to you, because I reached out to him on the MASH case. When we got involved, I talked to you for the first time the week of Christmas, because I remember that well, because you were preparing for Christmas with your family. And so we talked that whole week, and you started filling me in bit by bit about this case. And I said, "This is really strong, Diane. You gotta get somebody to look at it, somebody outside the state." Okay, so I said,
Oh, you gotta let them know what the commissioner told us about
yeah,
politicians.
right, we will. Okay, so all these things transpired after I got involved, because we started breathing like fire-breathing dragons down their throats. I mean, we just started pounding, because this is just insane that nobody's looking at this. So Richard said he shares the same frustrations. We're sending him all this stuff. He listens to one of the tapes. He's very disturbed by this confession tape, and he's trying to help us. And I think that Christopher Bokers from the Minneapolis FBI, this may have been the first time that he was aware of any of this 1997 evidence. I don't think anybody in Minneapolis field office knew about this evidence. Okay,
no,
so
I don't either.
So at this point, we're working with Richard, and we're sending him everything that we can, and I'm going through like a timeline of events as I'm learning them, because it's like a continuous learning process, because there's so much of it. And I'm sending all this to Richard, and Richard is forwarding what he can to Minneapolis field office, FBI, Christopher Bokers, and to Dennis Kern, who was also working on the case in Stearns County Sheriff's Office. Okay, so I said, well, and Richard said, well, I share the same frustrations. I'm trying to get outside investigators to look at it, but to no avail. This is what he wrote in his email. Okay, so fast forward into early spring. Okay, I get Dennis Kern on the phone from the Stearns County Sheriff's Office. He's one of the investigators. And he starts talking to me about, I start talking to him about, Diane has very, very, important prima facie
evidence.
Right, evidence on this case, a confession, corroborating witnesses, corroborating eyewitnesses, other witnesses that back up those witnesses. It's just insane what she has. And I said, what is going on in Stearns County? Why won't they investigate this? And he said, well, I've got some tapes that I entered about 3 weeks ago. And I'm like, well, why are you entering them now? Those tapes were brought there in 1997. And you're just now entering them? So basically, where did you get the tapes? Well, I know where you got the tapes. They weren't the actual tapes. They weren't hard copy tapes. It was the links that we sent him, that we sent to Richard Leonard. And Richard Leonard forwarded those links to him. And they downloaded those links. Because they never, because those tapes and that evidence was hidden. So they never got that information until when we started pushing it really hard at them.
Well, then when Kern and the FBI came here, when he first walked in, he said, geez, I thought this could be it. That's before he met with Stearns County. And they said, oh, no, it's Heinrich. Well, you can't...
No, that was when Chris Bokers came. He said, I think this could be it. Kern...
Yeah, the FBI, yeah.
Right, Kern. Okay, Dennis Kern and Chris Bokers from the FBI came there May 6th, 2015. Okay, because it was late 2014 when you and I started talking. May 2015, which there's, we were coming right up on the new year of 2015. May 2015, Dennis Kern and Chris Bokers from the Minneapolis FBI come there. You prepare for them. You go and sort through all of this evidence. You label it. You put it all in order. You get it all nice and neat and ready for them. And they come and they just stare at it. They don't touch any of it. So I don't know if they're just not allowing, they pulled the jurisdiction card and said, you can't look at this. I mean, you have evidence that shows that it's possible Jacob was taken across state lines, and that this would bring this in federal. But I think it would be federal anyway because it's a kidnapping. So I don't understand why Chris Bokers, wasn't able to just take that evidence and go. So a lot of time.
The FBI was called in on the abduction, but they never told them about this stuff.
Right. So like I was saying before, I don't think the Minneapolis FBI had any awareness. You were dealing with local FBI, and they weren't doing anything in St. Cloud. So you were just stuck going around in circles. It would just keep doing a 180. And
well, I wrote to about 31 officials, and I think when they called down here, they must have got well, we checked it out. There's nothing there.
Oh yeah, Stearns County.
I never heard back from any of them.
Of course, because Stearns County, they called Stearns County, and then it would do another circle back like a ricochet. Okay, so this was an ongoing, continuous dilemma, going on and on and on. And we told Richard Leonard at NCMEC about this, and this is when he says, I share the same frustrations. I'm trying to get outside investigators involved, but to no avail. Okay, so it was around this time that we contacted David Heinrich, and I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he was with the Attorney General's office, one of the attorneys with that office for the state of Minnesota. And I got lucky, and I just got him. They just patched me right through to him. I was able to connect with him on my first call. So he was listening intently when I was telling him about this, and it was right after that Dennis Kern and Chris Bokers came to your home and looked at this stuff. So I think that's what prompted that. Otherwise, I don't think they would have come at all. So I think they just came to show up. Okay, we went there, because they did nothing when they came there. And I think that the Attorney General's office was telling them that you need to go follow up with this. You need to do your job. Okay, well, when I talked to Richard Leonard, fast forward, into the last couple of years or so, when, all this stuff happened with Heinrich, which we'll get into, I said, there's something very wrong. These remains, after they, said that Heinrich confessed to his involvement in Jacob's disappearance and murder.
He never pled guilty in court, though.
No, he never pled guilty. They offered him this plea deal. What happened is, when we started pushing this so strong with Stearns County, and they knew we were not going to back down, suddenly Heinrich becomes a person of interest. All of it lines up with all these developments lined up with each development that we made. Every time we got a step forward, they would pull something out of their back pocket. So on October 29th, 2015, Heinrich becomes a person of interest. Suddenly. Now listen.
That when NPR was going to come out with this?
No, that was when the confession came. Okay, so this is 2015. Okay, now let's go backward to when I first got involved. Before I met you, I had a conversation with Jared Shirel, who was the victim from January of 1989. Okay, and they tried to connect the cases with his. They thought that maybe the perpetrator was the same person, okay, that took Jacob, the same person that assaulted him, could have been the person that abducted Jacob. So I spoke with him at that time, and he was talking with Joy Baker. And I got connected to him because, remember, this is before I met you, and we were talking about Harold Jerry Mash. And he said, wow, that sketch really looks like, Mash really looks like that sketch. And then he said, you've got my attention. And so we talked. And I don't remember when it was, whether it was September. It was soon after the hunt was on. So it could have been, I think it was sometime in September. And he said, well, I don't think it is MASH, though, because we're looking at a guy that's locked up in Moose Lake. Well, who's locked up in Moose Lake? That was Dwayne Hart. And what do you know, Diane? When we find those warrants, which I think it was around 2016 when they released all these warrants, Dan Rassier warrants and the Heinrich warrants. Well, there was another warrant in there, and that was for Dwayne Hart. And what was the date of that? August 2014. That's when they released the hunt, that show. They were going, to me, it appears that they were going to try to pin it on Dwayne Hart at that time. And that's where Jared Shiro's eyes were too. Okay, Jared Shiro was a victim. Heinrich was not even on the map at that time. They were looking at Dwayne Hart. There was a warrant for his property then. Well, Dwayne Hart had an alibi sitting in a file in Larry's office. They could not connect him to the case. So at that time is when I swooped into the picture, and then we started bringing all this up. Okay, so what do you know? May, they come out, they touch nothing, they do nothing. And we're still breathing heavily down their necks about all this evidence that you have. And then suddenly, October 29th, 2015, he becomes a person of interest. Okay, so all of the rest of 2015, which you're nearing the end of 2015 in October, into 2016, you and I are still going forth with our efforts to get this investigated, calling various officials, calling the press, anybody that we can get to make noise on this evidence.
Well, we called all the commissioners, and that's when Joe Persky said, I think the politicians covering your stuff up.
That's right. And while we talked to the commission...
Aren't you worried for your safety?
Yeah, are you worried for your safety? He said that to you, and he said that to me. Okay, so,
yeah.
All right. I'm like, well, I'm in Ohio, but I am worried about Diane because she's in the damn hornet's nest there. And we do suspect that there's corruption behind this case. We just don't know where to draw the lines. We just don't know how far it goes out. But there's something very wrong, especially in the Janelle Kendall area there, because she's the county prosecutor, and it was like crickets. Nothing was happening with her. Okay, so this was, actually 2017 is when this was happening, because he started asking us if we were concerned for our safety after this Heinrich confession. Okay, so there's this case in the minds of some people is still open after this confession. They didn't believe this whole Heinrich thing. Number one, you said he never pled guilty. Number two, in the burial sites, they didn't find any human remains. There is a report that says, outside of these warrants, on the warrant findings, there was no human remains on the warrant findings. But there's a report separate from that says there was a tooth that was an 80% match. They tried to refer to the tooth as bones. But you and I both know we had a conversation with Mark Mix, who admits and says we never said there was a body. And we have a recording of that. Okay, he's saying it, plain as day. We never said there was a body. Okay, so...
And he said that they told him to just agree with us.
Right. So he's basically trying to tell us in code, you know, they're covering it up. I mean, that's what it sounds like. We can't prove that, but that's what it sounds like. So this continues to go on, and then that's when the commissioners jumped in. Okay, and we started talking to Joe Persky. And I think we talked to him at another time before that because that's when he asked about our safety. But I think that was in 2016 or early 2017, possibly. And that's when I came out to Minnesota, was in 2017, in May of 2017. And at that time, we were talking quite a bit then because that's when he said, send like a summary of what's going on to the commissioners and we will help. And I got responses from other commissioners saying, we'll do our best, we'll do whatever we can. And so they confronted the sheriff, which was not Sheriff Sander, because after the confession, Sheriff Sander says, I'm leaving midterm, left office, midterm, walked away from his salary and said, I'm retiring. So you get an interim sheriff there, Sheriff Goodmanson, and so he's in office at the time these commissioners try to help, and they go to him and they say, hey, look at all this is pretty serious. And he goes, the case is solved, they found the body, end of story. The FBI said so too. Okay, so this is where it was left. Meanwhile, the Wetterlings find out we're not backing down. We're still carrying forward with this information. There's too much truth to it. There's too much corroboration. There's too much for it not to be a thing. This is a real big thing. And they're just walking away from it. I mean, they're just, the Stearns County is just walking further and further away from it. But
well, Goodman said they're not going to spend the money or manpower
right,
to look at.
Yeah, so that's what they're saying. Okay, so the Wetterling suddenly, after these commissioners get involved, and I'm telling you, right after the commissioners got involved is when the Wetterlings shut the file down. They went so far as to try to change federal FOIA laws to shut the file down and never release it. And they wanted to change the laws to make that happen. Federal laws. Now, what kind of behavior is that? Is that behavior of somebody that isn't worried? No, that's behavior of somebody that sounds pretty damn worried to me. That's craziness. So this is also around the time that we were examining these warrants. And that's when we found that there were no human remains. This was just prior, the prior year, we were finding out about these warrants before we talked to the commissioners. And these commissioners felt that this made a lot of sense. And we brought up Dan Rassier because that's when you were heavily into the investigation before I ever met you, and you were working with Larry, and Larry would help when he could. I believe they were doing something with Larry. They were threatening him or something because he would help, but he would help when you asked. It was like he couldn't initiate, but he would help whenever you asked. After he was involved with this, recording of the confession. All right, so it was at that point that, now I lost my train of thought here, but we were talking about the warrants, okay, and Dan Rassier. All right, wow, those warrants on Dan Rassier couldn't be more illegal. My God. Dan
told me they had them wrong and they added stuff in there.
Well, yeah, and that's coming from him, but we can prove it because I'm looking at newer interviews, more recent interviews, I'm saying within the last 5 years, of Aaron Larson, who is the eyewitness there with Jacob. He's Jacob's friend. He was there. And he has maintained the same eyewitness statement to this day. To this very day, he has maintained that it was pitch black And that, the same thing. They told us to lay down. They asked us our ages or our names, and then they took Jacob and told us to run and not look back. Told us he's got a gun. Okay, same thing they maintained all along. Well, interestingly, on the Dan Rassier warrants, which I have here, the important part, and this Ken McDonald writes a completely different story, changes the witness statements, everything customized to fit Dan Rassier's personality. Okay, he said Aaron described hearing footsteps in the gravel driveway as they approached. Aaron then described seeing a suspect or abductor coming from the driveway. He could see up the driveway with the help of a farm light. Really? Well, I just saw a recent interview where he's saying it's pitch black. He keeps saying in this interview, within the last 5 years, pitch black, pitch black, pitch black. Well, right here in the warrant, it's saying they could see with the help of a farm light. He said there was no vehicles. Well, that supports the story that it had to be Rassier because there were no vehicles, so it had to happen on his property. So they're saying there were
Really? But then they said Heinrich was sitting in his driveway.
Right, well,
the kids,
they changed.
The kids would have seen him.
Right, they changed the story when they, pinned it on Heinrich and made Heinrich the fall guy. So at this time, they're trying to make Dan Rassier the fall guy. So they said there were no vehicles in the driveway and there was no dog barking. Well, no, there wouldn't be a dog barking because the dog would recognize that it's just their owner, Dan Rassier, so the dog wouldn't bark, right? Okay, so they're trying to pin Rassier. It says the unknown gunman ordered the boys in the ditch and described, and I kind of got this marked out here. It said while the boys were in a ditch, the boys were ordered onto their stomachs. The gunman told Trevor to shut off the flashlight he was carrying. Really? Again, Aaron said it was pitch black. The suspect abductor asked the boys' ages, what their ages were. Trevor began to speak first, but the suspect ordered them to stop. The suspect wanted the boys to speak in order from left to right. Well, that would fit Dan Rassier's OCD kind of personality, right? So then he tapped Aaron and asked his age, then Trevor, then Jacob. Then he told Trevor to run into the woods or he would shoot. Next, he looked at Aaron's face and told him the same. The boys did as they were told. Okay, so the next... Oh, let me go. Hold on 1 second here. All right, so then it says, Trevor and Aaron then described Jacob forcefully taken by the suspect or abductor toward the Rassier farm. How can they see this? It's pitch black. They never said anything. These witnesses never said anything about seeing Jacob dragged up the Rassier driveway. And then they say after running for a short period of time, they turned and looked and did not see any vehicles on the road. How could they see anything? It's pitch black. Okay, so all of this...
They said they turned around, they didn't see Jacob or the perp.
So
gone.
all of this is insane. How could they just put those warrants through like that? So they sat there for all these years. Now, Dan Rassier was like my son's age, younger than my son at that time. So they took the bulk of his life, the bulk of his life, where you're living life to the fullest, for your 30s into your 60s, okay, and completely destroyed it by trying to... At one point, he said that Patty was following him around trying to get him to confess.
Yeah.
Just stalking him. So you tell me there's not something wrong with those Wetterlings when they're frickin' following him around, trying to get him to confess.
The department asked her to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and she was baking cookies for them all and the whole damn sickening thing. Okay, and meanwhile, this foundation, the longer they draw it out, the more money they're bringing in. Money, 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 money. Then we call the foundation, and what do we find out? There's 3 employees. you and Robin at some point talked to the foundation, and they said they don't look for kids. They don't have any part in that. So, and then I call the foundation, I find out there's 3 employees. Okay, so what do you think, how much money do you think comes in at one ball game in the Minnesota Twins or the Minnesota Vikings? And they go do a Jacob Day there, and they collect, $11 from 25,000 people, or however many people fit in that stadium. That's a lot of money. And that's just one event. Okay, so you're talking a lot of money here. All right, so where did all of it go? Where did it all go? So every time we called the foundation, they did not care about this evidence. Even before Heinrich was ever in the picture. And Heinrich was never on the map before this. The FBI had it right in 1990 when they cleared him and said they didn't have any evidence on him. And they said the same thing when they pulled him in as a suspect in 2015 in October. They made him a person of interest. And what happened then? What happened then? He denied any involvement in this. He denied it.
Yeah.
And suddenly, they picked him up on 25 counts of child pornography. Suddenly they tell him, we'll drop 24 of those 25 counts of child pornography. We won't charge you with the abduction. We will not charge you with the sexual assault. We will not charge you with the murder. You just have to show us where these remains are. And that's all.
They said it's because the parents just wanted Jacob back.
Right, and so the parents...
They didn't get him back.
Right, and the parents somehow had the ability or the right to make a decision on a huge, high-profile kidnapping and murder case to not charge Heinrich. That's crazy. So, even when the national news reported this, they didn't look like they could believe it or understand it, this plea deal.
They've sure been shut down, though.
So, they thought that we would stop. They thought we would stop. Well, we didn't, because this stuff there's too much corroboration. There's too much evidence. You can't just let something like that go. So, and then we forgot about when Chris Bokers came to your house. And this was just before the confession, the summer of 2016. He came to your house and he says, wow, I thought this could be it. I think this could be it. And he took some stuff from your house, some evidence. I remember you asked him to sit down and listen to a couple of the tapes. And then he left with a handful of evidence, some stuff. And he took it with him. And then he turned around, and I think he was standing in your foyer or just before he left, and he looked at you and he said, you may never see me again.
Yeah.
And then he denied it later when you confronted him about it. And
on the phone.
Yeah. And less than 48 hours later, we're talking business hours, because I think there was a weekend, and then early the next week he came and I was all excited. I'm like, oh, they're finally going to investigate it. I didn't hear from you for 3-4 hours. I'm like, wow, they're really going at it. That's great. So I get a call from you. You're madder than hell. I said, what happened? He said, I know you want to believe it's the Boehners, but they didn't do it. Heinrich's the guy. He's the guy. Half-hearted thumbs up. Half-hearted thumbs up, just like he looked defeated when he told you this. Okay, well, you weren't going to buy it. You told him, no way. No way at all. Just 1 minute. Sorry about that. Ron just stepped in. I had to tell him we were recording. Um, so
Yeah, we're gonna wind this up.
yeah, we got to wind this up. But this is right about the point where we are right now. Is that
Yeah.
we're still trying to make. Oh, let's get to the phone call from Julie Allen. Okay, so I reached out to the U.S. Prosecutor's Office, U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota. And I talked to Julie Allen in 2017. I think it's later 2017. And I said, Julie, you were involved in this plea deal, right? And she said, yes, I was. And I'm like, well, did you know about this 1997 evidence? And I started to tell her some of it, and she said, well, I know some of it, because I know that they looked at it and they couldn't find a connection or something like that. And I'm like, well, that's funny, because they only have about 10% of it, because they wouldn't come and look at the other 85% or 90% of it. So you weren't told the full story here, Julie. I said, did you look at the warrants? Did you see that the warrants were the witness statements were changed? Did you look at the warrant findings and see that there were no human remains? Did you look at all of this information before you got involved in the plea deal? Well, it was right about that time that it got real quiet. Like, she was like her life was flashing before her eyes. Like, have they not told me something? Was there something missing? I mean, I don't know what was running through her mind then, but she was quiet. So I continued to tell her the rest of the story. And then we hung up. And then a year later, in the summer of 2018, she calls me after hours from an unlisted phone number. And it's her. And I recorded the conversation. Part of it. We had limited ability. We were in a car. And I wasn't expecting the call, so it was a pretty awkward call. And we went for a ride, and I had ice cream melting on my lap, and it was just, I was not expecting to call at 7:30 in the evening. It was 6:30 their time. They're an hour behind us. And she told me that there needs to be an investigator that needs to bring this to her for her to do anything with it. And I said, an investigator? I said, Stearns County isn't going to do anything. That's the problem. And she said, and then that point, she said, any investigator, I need them to bring that to me. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know what we can do, because we can't get anybody. And you know the story. When we tried to call the FBI, and they somehow steered us, the FBI in Washington, and they steered us somehow to State Highway Patrol or some crazy. They were spinning us around in circles. So I don't know what's behind this Wetterling thing, but there's something not good for them to go to these lengths and to these efforts. The behaviors always give them away, and there's been too many odd behaviors, especially in these last 5 years, because there was like an all-out pushing effort, because Richard Leonard tried his best. I believe that he was he was a straight shooter, and that he was trying to help us. And at the last time I talked to him, one of the last times I talked to him, he said, try reaching out to the Attorney General and to the Attorney General's office. So I wrote him back and I said, the Attorney General's office or the U.S. Attorney's office? He said, both. Reach out to them both. Now, why is Richard Leonard, after the case is supposedly closed and solved, or this confession, because they never really admit that it's solved, why is he telling me to reach out to the Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney's office if the case is closed? Why is he going to look into this tape where we never heard anything back from him, but we sent him this latest tape on this other eyewitness that said he saw Jacob murdered? So why did we not hear back from him? So that's where the case is left right now. That's where we are currently. And you, at the time when you started working at this, you were working full time, sometimes 12 hours a day, and trying to work on this. You were not in it for the money. You were not in it to get some kind of attention. You stumbled into it. You heard truth. You heard corroboration to this, and you were just trying to. It bothered you. You couldn't sleep nights because this was very serious. And they were treating you like you were nuts. And they'd even tell this Pierce wasn't Pierce, Dougie Pierce, you know, bad mouthing you to the other. They were scared of you. That's what they were. They were scared. And they didn't know what to do with this person who had all this evidence and was smart enough to ask the right questions and connect the dots. So here we are.
Well, we can update this as we go along. So.
Right. Well, we'll see what happens, but I'll disconnect right now and just leave it where it is.